Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the 22nd chapter in the book of Proverbs, and a little past the midway point, around the 17th verse, comes what can be categorized as a narrative transition, which are generally classified as the sayings of the wise, which extend beyond the 22nd chapter. So in the interest of making it that far, we're going to just hop right into it, beginning with the opening verse, which reads, "A name is preferable to great riches. Grace is better than silver and gold." Now, by name, implicitly a good name is somewhat analogous or synonymous with good reputation, and not to deflate Solomon's standards, but reputation is a poor substitute for character. Anyone who values their own or anyone else's reputation above character is pretty much a worthless coward. But as for grace, grace is the unmerited divine favor, and that is more priceless and of a greater treasure than any earthly items of silver and gold. And Solomon had it all, but he was enabled to accumulate all the wisdom and the riches and the prestige that he did solely through an act of divine grace, of which we read of in First Chronicles, the first chapter. I did one on that, but I believe I typed it in as Second Chronicles chapter 1, and also First Kings chapter 3 for that visitation, which resulted in the grace he would receive and apply. "The rich and the poor meet together. Yahweh is the maker of them all." So even though the socio-economic barriers and distinctions between humanity divides the rich from the poor, we are all equal in the eyes of our Maker, who is the consummate Democrat, and the rich, as much as the poor, equally must stand before him in judgment to answer for the life which they lived. So there's a democratic equality about the divisive categories which we just divide ourselves into are completely and utterly meaningless to Yahweh. "A clever one foresees evil and hides himself, but the simple go on and are punished." So what the clever has that the fool or the simple lack is the quality of discernment, the virtue thereof, and prudence, which enables them to have foresight. They're able to anticipate and advance the evil which will eventually unfold and subsume them and all who come across its paths. And he will stay away from it like the plague, because there's nothing to gain in surrounding oneself or succumbing to evil or evil people. But the simple, lacking that foresight, discernment, prudence, and discretion, will march on straight ahead as a matter of course, following their own carnal lust, and be punished accordingly. And they will, every vice and sin invites consequences, not always necessarily in this lifetime, but certainly in the next. "The reward of humility is the fear of Yahweh, riches and esteem in life." Now, this was clearly true in Solomon's case, as I earlier mentioned. His vast accumulations, he was by figures adjusted to inflation, one of the trillionaire rulers in history. Yet this was this was in response to his humble response of prayer, when he asked for the wisdom to lead his people, and so pleased was Elohim by this answer that he deigned to grant him that for which he did not ask. He did not ask for the heads of his enemies, or great riches, or prestige, or long life, but he gave all of the above, but he did attach a condition to the long life, and that was inasmuch as he walked in the ways of his father David. That's going to come up in the 6th verse, which we'll soon get to. But this ought not be interpreted as an ironclad guarantee. The humble often go a-begging, and the arrogant are often arrogant to begin with and arrogant in the end, after a life devoted to the accumulation of wealth. "Thorn snares are in the way of the perverse. He who guards his life keeps far away from them." So this brings us back to the 3rd verse, which it essentially parallels, in that dangers and injuries await the path of the perverse, and But he who is prudent and guards his life, he who values his life, will stray away from the danger and foresee them with the exercise of discretion and discernment. Train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he turns not away from it. So childhood lays the foundation for the man or woman the child is to become, and parents are duty-bound and obligated to instruct them and educate them in manners, morals, and not leave the sole intellectual pursuits to the schools. Remember, there was no educational system as we know it in the ancient world, but rulers would have been the exception in the educative process. But that's slightly irrelevant to what I should communicate. But once again, this is an ironclad. This is not an ironclad guarantee, but it is a principle which generally should come true. Now, we do witness a palpable exception to this in Solomon, who was raised wisely by a man after Elohim's own heart, David, and he was instructed in righteousness, and for the better part of his life he did pursue it and not deviate from the course. But towards the end of his life, the other familial influences, not by blood but by marriage, his numerous pagan idolatrous wives, he allowed them to set up shop with their idols in his court and in Jerusalem, whereas his earlier marriage to Pharaoh's daughter, he allowed her to do so outside of the city limits, hence not contaminate the moral fabric and corrupt the spirituality of the nation he was charged to lead. So we do witness that even though Solomon wrote this in the middle years of his life, this book is generally ascribed to the middle years of his life. The Song of Solomon is generally attributed to the early years, and Ecclesiastes the later years. So sometime after the writing of this, he invalidated this promise, but the principle remains sound and intact. The rich rules over the poor, and the borrower is slave to the lender. These are self-evident socioeconomic facts. The rich have the resources to wield greater influence and power that the poor are bereft of, and anyone who becomes indebted to a lender or a loan shark is effectively enslaved to them inasmuch as they cannot pay, and this often invited consequences of slavery in the ancient world. So that's something to be mindful of. Never hastily borrow or take more than you can chew off, bite off more than you can chew. He who sows unrighteousness reaps trouble, and the rod of his wrath perishes. So reaping what you sow is the agricultural analogy used to an agricultural people of the ancient Hebrews, and the concept finds its nearest equivalent in the other religion of Hindu, which describes karma as the moral law of cause and effect. Roughly translated, how we treat others is how we can expect to be treated, and rightly so. So in Solomon's passage, the wicked and unrighteous, they sow it, and in other words, they act it, and it defines their behavior, and as a consequence, they reap trouble, often beyond the immediate beyond their immediate ability to see, but sure enough, the devastating consequences eventually, inevitably, and invariably manifest. He who has a good eye is blessed, for he gave his bread to the poor. So generosity is a virtue which the Judeo-Christian promotes, and the concern for the most vulnerable in society was very much embedded in the Mosaic Law and finds its echo in the Christian tradition. And Solomon was certainly a man who did not let his wealth, for the most part, go to his head, but he did eventually become rapacious in his ambition to construct agricultural wonders and edifices, which eventually compelled him to conscript unpaid Israelite laborers in explicit violation of the Mosaic Law, and this ultimately fermented the seed of the rebellion, which out of respect for his father, Yahweh prolonged until after his death, but due to the imprudent actions of his son and successor Rehoboam, the united monarchy would splinter in half. He who loves cleanses of heart, whose speech is pleasant, a king and his friend. As a king, he would have surrounded himself with this type of person, a loving person, pure of heart, and well-spoken, and not denigrative or in any way ill-speaking of others in any way, shape, or form. These are the qualities which he sought in a friend, and these are the ideal that he expressed. The eyes of Yahweh shall watch over knowledge, but he overturns the words of the treacherous. Now, as an omnipresent and omniscient being, those attributes translate as able to be everywhere or anywhere at once, and also the unlimited or infinite scope of intelligence. He knows all and sees all, and there's no escaping him. So the deeds that we do, the dirty deeds that we do in secret, are equally transparent as the more obvious sins of the flesh, which are easier to conceal from the eyes of man, but are equally transparent before Yahweh, and we are judged by our words. We read in Matthew 12:37 that every idle word which we utter will eventually be held to our account at the judgment, and rightly so, because words are very much a reflection of intention and the heart and the inner character of the one who speaks them. The lazy one says, "There is a lion outside. I am going to be killed in the street." Well, this is an absurd hypothetical, but to paraphrase one of the American authors of Proverbs, Proverbs is a literary device which consists of a pithy saying of condensed wisdom. Benjamin Franklin once quipped that he who is good at making excuses is seldom good for anything else. So the lazy man will forever seek to circumvent their duties and obligations and professional expectations by conjuring up excuses, no matter how likely or improbable or absurd, to get out of doing what needs to be done. And Solomon does not have two kind words to say for the lazy people, the lazy character. The mouth of a strange woman is a deep pit. The one denounced by Yahweh falls therein. So he also has equally unkind words to say about the caricature of the loose, moral, and wicked woman who is identified as an adulteress in other passages and implicitly in this one. And now the one who is astray and estranged from Yahweh will naturally be more vulnerable to succumb to the snares of their temptations. That's what strange women do. They speak to seduce and ultimately lead, I believe, in other places, the consorting with them, he quite frankly spells out, leads to the grave and ultimately to hell. Folly is bound up in the heart of a child. The rod of discipline drives it from him. Now, children are in one sense innocent, but in another sense they do not need to be taught how to sin. A child has no concept of ownership. They'll freely take, without even knowing they're stealing, they'll freely take what belongs to others. And so from birth we are essentially wayward creatures inclined to sin, but we need to be taught and instructed in order to perform righteous deeds. And this is the duty and obligation of the parent to administer discipline, physical force, lovingly. Now, by our postmodern standards, this may be interpreted as child abuse, but it's been the historical norm for children. You can physically administer discipline without being abusive to your children. This is not so much a delicate balancing act, but for some it does require extra effort. But we don't get the impression that Solomon struggled with this, or any righteous person ever did. One oppresses the poor to increase, another gives to the rich. only to come to poverty. So the presence of the poor and the rich are a fact in any society in human history, and there are respective responses and attitudes and actions we can take towards them. And the poor are vulnerable to exploitation and are bereft of legal defenses or the financial resources to protect themselves from exploitative and rapacious rich people. Now the natural man is naturally impartial towards the rich on account of they are able to provide, they're able to give them better favor, so they often favor them at the expense of the poor. But if you give all that you have to give to the rich, eventually you will impoverish oneself and be like the creatures you so much despise. And we're going to cut it short today. We reached the 15-minute mark. We might cover the sayings of the wise, which I mentioned earlier, beginning in verse 17 and extending beyond the 22nd proverb on another date. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. Tune in next time. Bye-bye.